The machines hum their steady rhythm in the dimness, a mechanical lullaby that has become the soundtrack to Eleanor Wentworth's nights. She pushes open the door to room 417 with her hip, balancing a tray of fresh IV bags against her side, and lets the weighted door close with its familiar soft click behind her. The private room smells like sterile sheets and the faint chemical tang of disinfectant. But underneath it all is something else. Something almost alive despite the stillness of the man in the bed. Alexander Ravenscroft, or so the chart claims, though Eleanor suspects that name is as carefully constructed as everything else about this patient. 3 weeks he has been here. 3 weeks of absolute unconsciousness following what the attending physician described in clinical terms as severe traumatic injuries consistent with a violent assault. The hospital administration guards information about him like state secrets, and the whispers among the nursing staff paint him as something dangerous, someone connected to the kind of people who resolve disputes with fists, and worse. Eleanor should be afraid of him, probably, but fear is hard to maintain for someone so utterly vulnerable, someone whose survival depends on her competent hands checking his vitals and adjusting his medications and turning him every 2 hours to prevent bed sores. She sets down the IV bags and moves to his bedside, her practiced fingers finding his wrist to check his pulse, even though the monitors tell her everything she needs to know. His skin is warm under her touch, alive in a way that still surprises her each shift despite weeks of tending to him. She has developed a habit with her comatose patients, something her supervisor would probably frown upon if she knew, something Eleanor tells herself is therapeutic, even if the medical literature offers only ambiguous support. She sings to them. Her mother taught her that music reaches places words cannot, that melody can slip through cracks in consciousness like light under a door. Tonight, the song that rises in her throat is the lullaby her mother sang when Eleanor was small and frightened of the dark, a melancholy tune about stars keeping watch through the night. Her voice is soft, barely above a whisper, trembling slightly on the high notes because exhaustion has seeped into her bones after 4 consecutive shifts, and her student loan payment is due, and Marcus has been calling again, leaving messages that start apologetic and end threatening. Eleanor does not know that Alexander has been conscious for 48 hours, that behind his closed eyelids he is fully aware and listening with an intensity that borders on hunger. She does not know that he has been awake since Tuesday evening when Vincent made the prearranged signal during visiting hours. Awake and utterly still because somewhere in his organization is a traitor who tried to kill him, and his survival depends on remaining apparently helpless until the betrayer reveals themselves. She does not know that her voice has become the marker by which he measures the long nights, that he finds himself waiting for the sound of her footsteps in the corridor, anticipating the moment she will enter and bring something real into his performance of unconsciousness. Now please take a moment and subscribe to our channel and comment where you are watching from and what time is it. It is always fascinating to see where these stories get all around the world. Thank you. The fluorescent lights in the corridor seem harsher when Eleanor arrives for her shift the following night. Or perhaps everything feels sharper now that she has allowed herself to become tangled in the mystery of the man in room 417. 2 security guards stand outside Alexander's door, new additions that were not there yesterday, their postures alert, and their eyes tracking her approach with professional suspicion. Eleanor's supervisor intercepts her before she can enter, a tight-lipped woman named Carol whose usual warmth has been replaced with bureaucratic distance. Carol tells her that protocols around the patient in 417 have been elevated, that Eleanor is to maintain strict professional boundaries, ask no questions about his condition or circumstances, and report any unusual visitors or requests immediately. The warning sits heavy in Eleanor's chest as she nods agreement, wondering what has changed, what invisible machinery has shifted in the hours since she last stood at Alexander's bedside. When she finally enters his room, she notices it immediately, the subtle wrongness that prickles at her trained instincts. His position in the bed has shifted slightly, his left arm now resting at a different angle than she remembers from her meticulous last check. His breathing pattern sounds different too, less mechanically regular and more naturally varied, though the monitors show nothing alarming. Eleanor tells herself she is being paranoid, that her exhaustion is manifesting as hypervigilance, that comatose patients do experience small movements and changes. She performs her checks with hands that feel clumsy, too aware of his warmth, the solid reality of him beneath her fingertips. Her mother used to sing about morning light breaking through the longest night, a hopeful melody that feels appropriate for reasons Eleanor cannot articulate, so she hums it softly while adjusting his IV line, unaware that Alexander is fighting every instinct to remain perfectly still as her fingers brush his forehead, checking for fever. She smells like jasmine tonight, he notices. Jasmine and the antiseptic sharpness of the hospital, a combination that has become achingly familiar during his conscious imprisonment. Eleanor's phone buzzes in her pocket, an angry wasp of sound that makes her hands shake as she pulls it out. The text from Marcus is short and vicious, demanding she stop ignoring him, insisting he has a right to see her, threatening consequences she knows he is capable of delivering. She silences the phone with fumbling fingers and looks at Alexander's still face, at the illusion of peace in his unconsciousness. She whispers that she feels safer in this room with an unconscious man than anywhere else in her world, a confession torn from exhaustion and fear that she would never voice to anyone awake. The words strike something deep in Alexander's chest, a protective fury he has no right to feel for this woman who barely knows him. The door opens without her hearing a knock, and two men in expensive suits enter with the presumptuous confidence of people accustomed to access. They claim to be Alexander's cousins, but Eleanor's instincts scream danger at the cold calculation in their eyes, at the way they assess the room like predators evaluating territory. She positions herself between them and her patient, professional armor snapping into place as she cites privacy regulations and doctor's orders with a steel she did not know she possessed. They leave after a tense minute, but their threat lingers like smoke. Eleanor notices the monitor then. Alexander's heart rate elevated during their presence, a detail medically curious enough to note in his chart, even as she tells herself it means nothing, just autonomic response to voices and disruption. She finishes her rounds and leaves, humming that melody about morning light, unaware that Alexander hears every note as she walks down the corridor. Unaware that in the darkness of room 417, he opens his eyes and makes a decision that will shatter the careful boundaries of both their worlds. Eleanor's night off falls on Thursday, and she spends it in her small apartment, trying not to think about room 417, trying not to wonder if the replacement nurse will notice the small things she has come to recognize as normal. The particular rhythm of Alexander's breathing, or the way his fingers sometimes rest against the sheet. The temp worker is a younger woman named Brittany, who checks boxes on charts without really seeing the patients, who performs tasks with efficiency but no curiosity, and she does not notice when one of the visitors from earlier in the week returns just after midnight. Vincent Colborne moves through the hospital with the confidence of someone who belongs, his expensive suit and calm demeanor enough to bypass the night security, who assume he is family or perhaps a lawyer. He enters room 417 and closes the door behind him, moving to Alexander's bedside with the ease of long familiarity. Vincent leans close enough that his whisper barely disturbs the air, telling Alexander that they have identified the traitor, that it was James Sinclair all along, feeding information to the Castellano family in exchange for territory promises that would never be kept. Vincent asks if Alexander wants them eliminated now, or if he wants to handle it personally when he emerges from his strategic unconsciousness. Alexander, maintaining the absolute stillness that has become second nature over these long weeks, gives the slightest movement of his index finger against the sheet, a prearranged signal that means proceed, that means handle it, that means he trusts Vincent to dispense the justice that keeps their organization intact. Vincent nods once and disappears as quietly as he arrived, and Brittany never notes the visit in her charts because she never knew it happened. When Eleanor returns to work on Friday night, Exhausted from a day spent fielding calls from Marcus that have escalated from apologetic to threatening, she discovers that Alexander has been moved. Carol intercepts her at the nurse's station with tight lips and anxious eyes, explaining that the patient in 417 was transferred to the private wing on the fourth floor, the section reserved for VIP cases with round-the-clock specialized care. Eleanor's heart does something complicated in her chest, a lurch of concern she has no right to feel. She asks why, and Carol tells her there were security concerns, potential threats, that administration is taking no chances with this particular patient. Eleanor is assigned to other patients that night, kept deliberately away from the fourth floor, but James Sinclair finds her during her break. He is a cold man with pale eyes that assess her like she is a problem requiring solution. He asks about her interactions with the patient formerly in 417, about whether she noticed anything unusual, whether anyone tried to speak with her about him, whether she has any information about his condition or identity beyond what the charts reveal. Eleanor's anxiety spikes as she realizes she is being interrogated, that somehow her habit of singing to comatose patients has become something suspect. She tells Sinclair the truth, or the version of truth that matters, that she provided standard care, that she noticed nothing unusual, that she knows nothing beyond her professional duties. Sinclair watches her with those cold eyes for a long moment before telling her to maintain distance from that patient going forward, that her services are not required in the private wing, that she should focus on her assigned rounds. Eleanor nods agreement, but something in his tone feels wrong, feels like threat wrapped in professional courtesy. That night she cannot focus, her mind returning again and again to Alexander alone in some private wing, surrounded by security that may or may not have his best interests at heart. She tells herself her concern is ridiculous, that he is just a patient, that she has no reason to feel protective of an unconscious stranger who may or may not be the criminal the rumors suggest. But near 3 a.m., when the hospital falls into its deepest quiet, Eleanor finds herself walking toward the fourth floor. The private wing is hushed and dimly lit, more like a luxury hotel than a hospital. A guard sits outside one of the rooms, but he is absorbed in his phone and does not notice when Eleanor slips past. She finds Alexander's new room by instinct, by the pull she refuses to acknowledge. The door is unlocked and she enters without knocking, her heart hammering with the transgression. Moonlight streams through a large window, illuminating Alexander's face with silver light. And for the first time, Eleanor truly looks at him. She has been professional until now, clinical in her observations, but in this stolen moment, she allows herself to see him. The scar along his jawline speaks of violence survived, a thin white line that curves from ear to chin. His mouth is cruel in its beauty, lips that suggest both sensuality and ruthlessness. Even unconscious, his build radiates strength, shoulders broad enough to carry weight, hands that rest against white sheets, with a grace that suggests controlled power. This man is dangerous, Eleanor realizes with a clarity that should send her running. Dangerous even in stillness, perhaps especially in stillness because the potential energy of him fills the room like electricity before a storm. She does not sing tonight, cannot find her voice past the recognition of what he might be. Instead, she pulls a small book of poetry from her pocket, a collection of verses about longing and loss that she has carried since college. She sits in the chair beside his bed and reads aloud, her voice soft and soothing, offering him words written by people long dead about feelings that never die. Alexander listens to verses about desire that cannot be spoken and love that exists despite reason. Fighting every instinct to open his eyes and see her face more clearly, to watch her mouth form these words about yearning. Eleanor reads for 20 minutes and then closes the book, her fingers trembling slightly. She tells his still form that she looked him up online during her night off, that she found nothing, no social media presence, no public records, nothing but absence where a person should leave traces. She admits that the nothing frightens her more than criminal records would have. That absence of that magnitude suggests power and danger beyond her comprehension. She confesses she will stop coming, that she is getting too attached to a ghost, that singing to him and reading to him and wondering about him has become something unhealthy, something that blurs boundaries she needs to maintain. As she stands to leave, her hand brushing his one last time in farewell, Alexander makes his move. Alexander's hand closes around Eleanor's wrist with a grip that is gentle, yet absolutely unbreakable. Warm fingers encircling the delicate bones there with shocking tenderness, considering the raw power she can feel thrumming beneath his skin. Her gasp tears through the quiet room, sharp and startled, every nerve in her body suddenly alive with an electric terror that wars with something else, something she has no name for and refuses to examine. His eyes open and meet hers with an intensity that stops the scream building in her throat before it can form. Those dark eyes, fully aware and burning with intelligence, and something that looks dangerously like recognition, like he knows her in ways that should be impossible. His voice comes out rough as gravel when he speaks, unused for weeks except in her imagination, telling her not to be afraid, that he will not hurt her, and the words should be meaningless coming from a man who has been deceiving her since she does not know when, but somehow they bypass her rational mind and speak directly to some instinct she did not know she possessed. Eleanor's nursing training battles fiercely with her instinct to flee, clinical observation warring with primal fear as she recognizes immediately what his open eyes and deliberate grip mean, that he has been awake not just now but perhaps for days, perhaps for every moment she stood beside him singing and confessing and reading poetry like a fool. She demands to know why, her voice shaking with betrayal and confusion and anger that tastes like copper on her tongue, demanding to know how long he has been lying there listening to her bare her soul to what she thought was an unconscious stranger. Alexander releases her wrist, but the warmth of his fingers seems branded into her skin as he asks her to stay, to listen, his rough voice carrying an authority that makes the request sound like something between a command and a plea. He explains in minimal detail that someone tried to kill him, that his survival depended on appearing vulnerable until he identified the threat within his organization. That consciousness would have painted a target on anyone who spent too much time at his bedside. Eleanor's mind races through the implications cascading like dominoes. The security guards and the dangerous visitors and James Sinclair's cold interrogation and the rumors that whispered through the hospital corridors about criminal connections and violence. She accuses him of using her, of manipulating her confessions and songs for his own entertainment, of turning her compassion into something ugly and exploitative. Alexander does not deny it, but his eyes hold something raw when he tells her that her voice became the only real thing in his performance of unconsciousness, that her presence was not part of any plan, that she should not have mattered but somehow she does. Eleanor does not believe him, cannot afford to believe him, when belief means acknowledging the connection she has felt growing between them, despite the absolute impossibility of it. She moves toward the door, but he speaks her full name. Eleanor Marie Wentworth, along with details only someone who listened with careful attention would know, her mother's lullaby about sparrows finding home, her student debt amount of $127,000, her ex-boyfriend Marcus Chen, who calls at 2 a.m. with threats wrapped in apologies. The intimacy of his knowledge paralyzes her more effectively than his grip did. The realization that he heard everything, remembered everything, that she has been seen in ways she has never allowed anyone to see her. He tells her she was right to feel safe in this room, that she is safe with him, safer than she knows, and his certainty should be arrogance, but sounds instead like a vow. Eleanor's professional instinct kicks in despite the surreal horror of the situation, and she checks his vitals with shaking hands, asking how long he has been awake, if he is in pain, if he needs the doctor, falling back on clinical protocols because they are the only solid ground in a reality that has suddenly become liquid and treacherous. Alexander finds her clinical concern, amid fear, oddly endearing. a tenderness flickering across his dangerous face as he tells her, 2 days fully conscious, longer in partial awareness drifting in and out. He refuses to let her call the doctor yet, and Eleanor argues this is medically irresponsible, that he could have complications, that she could lose her license for not reporting a conscious patient. Alexander counters that it is survival, that doctors report to administrators who report to board members, and one of those links is compromised, that his apparent vulnerability is the only thing keeping certain people complacent until his own people can move. Their standoff crackles with tension until voices in the hallway shatter the moment, and Alexander moves with fluid speed that should be impossible for someone supposedly comatose for weeks, pulling Eleanor down beside the bed, his hand covering her mouth gently as the door opens and light spills across the floor where she was just standing. 2 orderlies enter for a routine check, and their flashlights sweep across the room in methodical arcs that cut through the darkness like searchlights hunting for something hidden. And Alexander has already returned to his still pose with eyes closed and breathing regulated into the shallow rhythm Eleanor has come to recognize as his comatose pattern. Eleanor crouches beside the bed with her heart hammering so violently she is certain the sound must be audible. His hand still resting against her jaw with fingers warm and solid, a touch that should feel threatening, but instead anchors her in this moment of crystallized terror. The orderlies complete their check with professional efficiency, noting vitals on a tablet and adjusting the IV bag with movements that speak of countless identical checks in countless identical rooms, and then they are gone, the door clicking shut behind them and plunging the room back into moonlit silence. In the darkness, Eleanor becomes acutely aware of Alexander's proximity in ways she was too frightened to notice moments before, the heat of his body radiating against her side where she crouches pressed against the bed frame, the controlled strength in his grip that holds her steady without causing pain, the scent of him that is antiseptic, and something else. Something masculine and foreign that makes her pulse spike for reasons that have nothing to do with fear. When he releases her, she tastes danger on her tongue and something else she refuses to name, something that feels like electricity and foolishness, and a door opening onto a country she has never visited. She whispers urgently that this is insane, that she could lose her license for not reporting a conscious patient immediately, that every moment she stays makes her more complicit in whatever deception he is orchestrating. Alexander tells her she should report him, that he has no right to ask for her silence, but he is asking anyway, and his voice in the darkness carries a weight that makes the request feel like something far more significant than hospital protocol violations. Eleanor demands to know why she would risk everything for a stranger who lied to her, who used her compassion as entertainment during his calculated performance. Alexander's answer is simple and devastating, delivered with a certainty that turns her blood cold. Because the men who put him here will kill anyone they think helped him, and her kindness has made her visible to people who see kindness as weakness to exploit. Eleanor feels cold dread spreading through her chest like ice water as she insists she is nobody, that no one would notice a night shift nurse who sings to comatose patients. Alexander tells her she has been seen entering his room off schedule, that James Sinclair reports to the people who want him dead, that her compassion has marked her as someone who matters to Alexander, and therefore someone who represents leverage or liability. Eleanor realizes with sick clarity that she has walked into a trap without knowing traps existed, that her small, safe life has been penetrated by something vast and dark. Alexander offers her a choice, with a gentleness that somehow makes the brutality of the options clearer. Walk away now, and he will ensure she is transferred to another hospital with a glowing reference. Disappear from his life safely, before the connections become indelible, or trust him to protect her through what comes next. Eleanor's practical nature wars violently with the inexplicable pull she feels toward this dangerous man, her mind screaming that survival means distance while something deeper insists that safety lies in proximity to power. She asks what comes next, and Alexander tells her he is leaving tonight, that his people are in place, that the traitors will be handled with the finality his world demands. He says she can forget him, Or she can follow him out of this hospital and let him keep her safe until the threat is eliminated, until her visibility no longer makes her a target. Eleanor knows the smart choice because she has always made the smart choice, has built her entire modest life on smart choices that kept her safe and small and unnoticed. She asks how he plans to walk out when he has supposedly been comatose for weeks, and Alexander smiles for the first time. A predatory expression that should terrify her, but instead sends something hot and reckless through her veins. He tells her that is where she comes in, and Eleanor understands that she has already decided that the choice was made in some moment she cannot identify when his voice in the darkness became necessary. Eleanor finds herself conspiring in a plan that violates every professional oath she has taken, every principle drilled into her during nursing school about patient advocacy and ethical responsibility, and the wrongness of it sits in her stomach like lead, even as her hands move with practiced efficiency to execute Alexander's precise instructions. She will document a sudden neurological event requiring immediate transfer to a specialist facility. She will accompany him as attending nurse during transport following hospital protocol for unstable patients, and she will follow the ambulance to a secondary location where his people will take over, each step a crime that compounds the last. Her hands shake as she falsifies medical records at the nurse's station while the corridor remains blessedly empty, typing words that could end her career and land her in prison, fabricating vitals and symptoms with enough medical plausibility to withstand casual scrutiny, but not forensic investigation. Alexander watches her internal struggle from where he has returned to lying still in the bed, his expression unreadable in the dim light, and he tells her quietly that she can still refuse, that he will find another way. But they both know the window for that choice has closed the moment James Sinclair's name was spoken aloud. At 3 a.m., when the hospital reaches its deepest quiet, Vincent and another man built like a wall arrive in paramedic uniforms that look legitimate enough to pass inspection, wheeling a private ambulance to the service entrance with paperwork signed by a doctor Eleanor has never met, but whose credentials check out when she nervously verifies them in the system. The transfer happens with surprising legitimacy that speaks to Alexander's reach and resources, orderlies helping move him onto the gurney with professional detachment, no one questioning the sudden decline of a patient who has been stable for weeks because the documentation tells a convincing story. As they wheel Alexander through corridors Eleanor has walked 1,000 times, James Sinclair appears from a shadowed alcove with suspicious eyes, tracking their movement like a predator sensing something wrong with the herd. And Eleanor's fear must show on her face because Alexander's hand finds hers beneath the blanket. A brief squeeze of reassurance that sends electricity racing up her arm and somehow steadies her enough to meet Sinclair's gaze without flinching. In the ambulance, Eleanor expects relief, but finds only escalating surreality as Alexander sits up fully the moment the doors close, all pretense of unconsciousness dropped like a discarded costume, his movements fluid and powerful as Vincent hands him a phone and a gun that gleams dully in the amber interior lights. Eleanor presses herself against the ambulance wall as the reality of who and what Alexander is crystallizes with brutal clarity in the presence of that weapon. The metal reality of violence he carries as casually as she carries a stethoscope. Alexander makes 3 calls in a language Eleanor does not speak, something Slavic or Eastern European, his voice cold and authoritative, and nothing like the vulnerable patient she sang to, each word carrying the weight of absolute command. When he finishes, he looks at her with those intense dark eyes that seem to see through every defense she has ever constructed, and tells her there is a safe house prepared, that she will stay there under guard until his business is concluded, that he will explain everything then when the immediate danger has passed. Eleanor asks if she is a prisoner, needing to hear him name what this is, and Alexander considers the question with unsettling honesty that refuses to soften the edges. He tells her she is protected, that whether she sees that as imprisonment depends on her perspective and her willingness to trust his word. The ambulance stops not at a hospital, but at a private airfield, where a sleek jet waits with stairs extended like an invitation to a point of no return. And Eleanor's protests escalate to panic as she realizes how completely she has lost control of her own trajectory. She is not getting on a plane with armed criminals, not disappearing into whatever world Alexander inhabits beyond the boundaries of her safe small life. Alexander's patience shows its limits for the first time, a hardness entering his expression as he tells her Marcus showed up at her apartment 2 hours ago, that he broke her door and trashed her belongings looking for her, that police were called, but he disappeared before they arrived. Eleanor's blood turns cold as Alexander shows her phone footage from a security camera she did not know existed. Grainy but clear enough to watch her ex-boyfriend's violent rage, his destruction of her small safe space, the brutal, methodical way he tears through her life looking for something to hurt. Alexander asks if she wants to go back to that or forward with him, and Eleanor realizes that her safe small life was an illusion, that danger found her long before Alexander did. Eleanor boards the plane in numb silence with her world fracturing into before and after along a fault line she cannot locate precisely, knowing only that the woman who walked into that hospital room to sing no longer exists, and whoever she is becoming has not yet taken solid shape. The private jet's luxury feels obscene against her turmoil, all cream leather and polished wood and soft lighting that belongs in magazines about lives she will never live. Except, apparently, she is living this now, sitting in a seat that probably costs more than her yearly salary while armed men move through the cabin with casual efficiency. Alexander speaks quietly with his men while Eleanor straps herself into a leather seat with hands that have finally stopped shaking, though whether that represents acceptance or shock, she cannot determine, trying to process how thoroughly her life has derailed in the span of hours, how completely the careful structure she built has collapsed. The flight is short, less than an hour, landing at another private field surrounded by dense forest that looks like something from a different country, though they cannot have traveled far enough for that to be true, the trees standing like sentries around the isolated runway. A car waits on the tarmac, black and expensive with windows tinted so dark they look like portals into nothing, and Eleanor climbs in because the alternative is standing on a runway in the middle of nowhere with no idea where nowhere actually is. During the drive, Alexander sits beside her, no longer the patient she tended, but fully himself, commanding, dangerous, magnetic in ways that make her want to press herself against the opposite door and lean closer simultaneously. He explains in measured terms that his organization controls significant territory across 3 states, that a faction attempted a coup while he appeared vulnerable, that his apparent helplessness was bait to draw them out into positions where they could be identified and eliminated. Eleanor asks what he does exactly, needing to hear him say it without the softening distance of words like organization and territory. Alexander does not insult her with euphemisms or comfort her with lies. He tells her he runs an organization that operates outside the law, that he controls trade networks both legal and illegal, that violence is a tool he uses when necessary without hesitation or regret. He also tells her his word is absolute in his world, that when he gives his word it becomes law, and he has given his word that she will not be harmed by him or anyone under his command. Eleanor should be revolted by the casual admission of criminality, by the cold pragmatism with which he discusses violence as methodology. Some part of her is revolted, the part that followed rules and believed in systems and thought safety came from staying small and unnoticed. But another part, a part she did not know existed until tonight, feels alive in a way her safe small life never made her feel, feels the electric charge of being seen by someone who exists at full volume. The safe house is not a house, but an estate, sprawling and secured with high walls topped with cameras and armed guards stationed at intervals that speak of serious threat assessment, and Eleanor understands that this is Alexander's world made visible. Power and danger and control extending in all directions. Alexander leads her inside personally with his hand at the small of her back, a touch that is proprietary and protective and presumptuous in ways she should object to, but does not. He shows her to a suite of rooms that could fit her entire apartment twice over, all elegant neutrals and expensive furniture, and windows that overlook gardens lit by subtle pathway lights. And he tells her to rest, to eat, that someone will bring her clothes and anything she needs. Eleanor spins on him then, exhausted and overwhelmed, and needing to understand what transaction is occurring beneath the surface of his solicitousness, demanding to know what he wants from her, why he did not just let her walk away when he had the chance. Alexander steps closer into her space, and she feels the full force of his presence, the controlled power that radiates from him like heat. He tells her he does not know yet, that she should not have mattered, that her voice in the darkness was not supposed to become essential to him. His honesty disarms her more effectively than comfort would have. Eleanor tells him she sang to a comatose patient, not to a mafia boss, that she does not know him at all, and he does not know her. Alexander agrees, but counters that she knows the man who listened in the dark, who heard her fears and her kindness and her loneliness, and that man wants to keep her close enough to discover if what he felt in that darkness translates into light. The admission hangs between them dangerous and electric, a confession that shifts the ground beneath her understanding of what this is. A knock interrupts the moment before Eleanor can formulate a response. Vincent enters with news that requires Alexander's immediate attention, his expression grim in ways that make Eleanor's nursing instincts recognize crisis. Alexander tells Eleanor to lock the door behind him, to trust no one but Vincent and a woman named Sophia who will attend her, and then he is gone, and Eleanor collapses onto the bed that is too soft and too large, alone in a gilded cage of her own making. Eleanor wakes to afternoon light streaming through unfamiliar windows, and the smell of food that makes her stomach clench with hunger she had not noticed until now. Disoriented for a moment before memory crashes back with the weight of everything that has happened in the span of hours that feels like years. A woman in her 50s sits in a chair near the window reading a leather-bound book, elegant in the way that speaks of old money and careful cultivation. Her silver-streaked dark hair pulled back in a style that emphasizes sharp cheekbones and eyes that miss nothing when they lift to assess Eleanor with the thoroughness of a scientist examining a specimen. She introduces herself as Sophia Beaumont, head of Alexander's household and the closest thing he has to family, her voice carrying the cultured neutrality of someone who has seen everything and judges little, though Eleanor suspects that judgment happens constantly beneath that polished surface. Sophia's assessment is thorough and uncomfortably perceptive as she sets aside her book and explains that she has brought food, clothing options, and information about how this household functions, her gaze cataloging every detail of Eleanor's appearance and finding her wanting in ways that make Eleanor acutely aware of her wrinkled clothes and tangled hair. She tells Eleanor that Alexander has never brought a woman to this house in the 15 years she has managed his private affairs, that his interest is unprecedented and therefore dangerous for them both, because precedent creates expectation, and expectation creates vulnerability in a world where vulnerability gets people killed. Eleanor insists she is not here by choice, that this is protective custody and nothing more. That whatever Sophia thinks she sees is a misunderstanding born of extraordinary circumstances. Sophia's smile is knowing in ways that make Eleanor want to argue further and also retreat from scrutiny that sees too much. She tells Eleanor that Alexander's protection is not given lightly, that it means something specific in his world, that Eleanor has already been claimed whether she understands the implications or not, and claiming in Alexander's world is as binding as any legal contract, and far more dangerous to break. The word claimed sends conflict surging through Eleanor, a mix of outrage at the presumption and something darker she refuses to examine that feels like satisfaction at being wanted with such intensity. Sophia softens slightly, perhaps reading Eleanor's distress, and offers practical help, clothes that fit properly, information about the house rules that will keep her safe, and honest answers to questions if Eleanor is brave enough to ask them. Eleanor asks what happened to the people who betrayed Alexander, needing to understand what justice looks like in this world she has fallen into. Sophia tells her they are being handled with the efficiency Alexander applies to all problems, that his justice is swift and final, that by morning the threat will be eliminated and the power structure restored. Eleanor asks if that means murder, forcing herself to use the word without euphemism. Sophia does not flinch from the brutal reality. She explains that in Alexander's world, betrayal has only one consequence, that mercy is weakness that gets good people killed, that the men who tried to murder Alexander in his hospital bed forfeited their right to breathing when they broke the codes that keep their violent world from descending into chaos. She asks Eleanor directly if she can accept that reality, if she can sit at table with a man whose hands are stained with blood, if she can separate the man who listened to her songs from the killer who eliminates threats without hesitation or regret. Eleanor does not know, cannot reconcile the two versions of Alexander into one coherent person. Sophia leaves her to dress and explore the suite, suggesting that answers come easier when basic needs are met. Eleanor finds a wardrobe filled with clothes in her exact size, expensive labels she recognizes from magazines, styles that match her taste with unsettling accuracy. The implications of Alexander's preparations unsettle her more than almost anything else. He planned for this, for her, had someone research her preferences and purchase an entire wardrobe before she ever agreed to come here. She showers in a bathroom larger than her bedroom, trying to reclaim some sense of normalcy through routine. When she emerges dressed in clothes that fit perfectly, Sophia returns to escort her to dinner. Eleanor protests that she is not a guest, that she does not want to pretend the situation is normal or acceptable. Sophia tells her that Alexander requested her presence, and in this house his requests are commands that even Eleanor is not exempt from, though her tone suggests sympathy for Eleanor's resistance. Eleanor's independence bristles at being summoned, but she follows because the alternative is hiding in her room like a child. The dining room is formal and intimidating, all dark wood and crystal and the kind of oppressive elegance that makes Eleanor feel like an imposter. Alexander sits at the head of a long table, cleaned up and devastatingly handsome in dark clothes that emphasize the breadth of his shoulders and the danger he wears like a second skin. He stands when she enters, manners at odds with his criminal reality, and Eleanor feels the impact of his full attention like a physical force. Dinner is served by silent staff who appear and disappear with choreographed efficiency. Alexander asks about her comfort, if the rooms are acceptable, if Sophia has been helpful, playing the role of solicitous host. Eleanor answers mechanically, the surreal politeness of the situation absurd, given that she is essentially a captive, no matter how gilded the cage. Alexander dismisses the staff with a subtle gesture, leaving them alone in the cavernous room. He tells her his business is concluded, that the betrayers are dead, that his position is secure and the threat to her has been eliminated. Eleanor's food tastes like ash. She asks if he killed them himself, needing to know if the hands that touched her so gently are the same hands that ended lives tonight. Alexander meets her eyes without hesitation and tells her yes. The honesty is brutal and somehow more disturbing than a lie would have been. Eleanor should run. Instead, she asks why he is telling her. Alexander leans back in his chair with the controlled grace of a predator entirely certain of his dominance, studying Eleanor with unnerving focus that makes her feel simultaneously exposed and seen in ways no one has ever bothered to look before. He tells her he is telling her because she deserves truth, because he will not build whatever this is on deception, because the foundation matters when you are constructing something meant to last. Eleanor challenges what this is with more force than she feels, reminding him she is here because leaving meant danger, because he presented her with an impossible choice dressed up as agency. Alexander acknowledges that with a slight incline of his head, but asks if that is the only reason she is sitting at his table, instead of demanding he make good on his promise of safety and distance, if fear is truly what keeps her in that chair, when she could be locked in her suite, refusing all contact. The question cuts too close to the confusion Eleanor has been suppressing since the moment his hand closed around her wrist in that hospital room. She argues that Stockholm Syndrome is not attraction, that trauma bonding is not connection, that psychology has documented how captives develop feelings for captors as survival mechanism. Alexander's slight smile suggests he expected that response, and finds it somehow endearing rather than insulting. He tells her she is probably right, that time will prove it one way or another, that she is free to leave whenever she wants, but he hopes she will stay until she is certain whether what she feels is real or manufactured by extraordinary circumstances. Eleanor asks what happens if she stays, needing parameters around this undefined situation. Alexander's answer is careful, each word selected with precision. He tells her he wants to know her outside of hospital darkness, to hear her voice when she is not singing to someone she thinks cannot hear, to discover if the connection he feels is real or born of circumstances that strip away the usual pretenses people hide behind. His vulnerability is unexpected and disarming, this powerful, dangerous man admitting uncertainty about anything. Eleanor feels the pull of him, magnetic and dangerous and entirely unlike anything in her careful, constructed life. She tells him this is insane, that she is a nurse from a modest background with student loans and a small life, that his world of violence and power and wealth does not intersect with hers in any sustainable way. Alexander agrees they should not intersect, but they do, and he has never been good at denying what he wants once he identifies it clearly. Eleanor asks what he wants, her voice barely steady. The intensity in his gaze makes her breath catch and hold. He tells her everything, but he will settle for time, time to prove she is safe with him, time for her to decide without fear clouding judgment, time to see if the woman who sang in the darkness can accept the man who listened and wanted to keep listening forever. Eleanor knows she should refuse, should demand the safe exit he promised, should protect herself from the inevitable pain of wanting someone whose hands end lives. Instead, she asks how much time, and the question is capitulation. Alexander tells her as much as she needs, days or weeks or months, whatever it takes for her to be certain. The negotiation feels like surrender and victory simultaneously, like she is losing herself and finding something she did not know was missing. That night, Eleanor lies awake in the luxurious suite with her mind racing through implications and possibilities. Her phone, returned to her with a new secure number, shows messages from friends and coworkers worried about her sudden disappearance. A story has been created without her input, a family emergency requiring extended leave, everything documented and explained with the thoroughness that characterizes everything Alexander does. His reach is evident in every detail, in the perfectly crafted lie and the concerned responses and the seamless way her life has been managed. Eleanor should be frightened by that control. Eleanor should be frightened by that control, by the ease with which Alexander has rearranged her entire existence without permission. But instead, she finds herself wondering what it means that he cared enough to construct such an elaborate protection around her life. What it says about his intentions that he thought through every detail, down to the concerned messages from her supervisor and the flowers sent to her non-existent sick relative. She scrolls through the fabricated correspondence, each message another brick in the wall separating her old life from whatever this new reality is becoming, and the competence of it all is somehow more seductive than any romantic gesture could be, because it speaks to a man who plans, who thinks ahead, who protects what he claims as his with the same ruthless efficiency he applies to eliminating threats. The thought should appall her, this idea that she has been claimed like territory in one of his business arrangements, but lying in the dark surrounded by luxury she could never afford. Eleanor cannot deny the forbidden thrill that runs through her at being wanted with such intensity by a man who clearly takes what he wants and keeps it. Sleep comes in fragments, her dreams a confused tangle of hospital rooms and gunfire, of Alexander's eyes opening in the darkness and his hand gentle against her mouth, of singing lullabies to a man who heard every word and decided she was worth upending both their lives to keep. She wakes to morning light and the realization that she has been in this house for barely 24 hours, and already her resistance is crumbling. Already she is thinking in terms of staying rather than leaving. Already she is wondering what it would mean to let herself fall into this dangerous attraction. Sophia brings breakfast on a tray, her knowing eyes cataloging Eleanor's restless night with uncomfortable accuracy, and tells her that Alexander is occupied with business calls, but requests her company in the garden at noon if she is willing. The phrasing is careful, a request not a command, and Eleanor recognizes it as Alexander keeping his promise to give her choice, even as every element of her situation is designed to keep her here. She agrees because refusing feels like cowardice, like running from something she needs to confront, and also because the truth is, she wants to see him again, wants to test whether last night's intensity was real or manufactured by candlelight and wine and the unreality of her circumstances. The morning passes slowly as Eleanor explores the suite more thoroughly, finding books selected to match her taste, music she recognizes as her favorites, small touches that reveal how thoroughly Alexander researched her before deciding she was worth this effort. The evidence of his attention should feel invasive, but instead makes her feel seen in ways no one has bothered to see her before, not the boyfriends who never asked about her dreams, not the friends who loved her, but never really looked past the surface of capable nurse Eleanor, who had her life together. At noon, she descends the curving staircase feeling absurdly nervous, dressed in clothes Alexander provided that fit perfectly and make her look like someone who belongs in a house like this, someone who could stand beside a man like him without looking diminished by the comparison. He waits in the garden, dressed casually in dark pants and a shirt with sleeves rolled to reveal forearms marked with scars. And when he sees her, his expression shifts into something Eleanor cannot quite name, but feels in her chest like recognition. Alexander waits in the garden surrounded by carefully maintained greenery that speaks of wealth and attention to detail, dressed casually in dark pants and a shirt with sleeves rolled to reveal forearms marked with scars that tell stories Eleanor suspects she should fear, but finds herself wanting to know. And when he sees her, his expression shifts into something Eleanor cannot quite name, but feels in her chest like recognition, like the moment when a key finally turns in a lock that has been jammed for years. He gestures to a small table set with coffee and pastries, an intimacy that feels more dangerous than any of the violence implied by his world. And Eleanor sits because refusing feels like admitting how much power he already holds over her increasingly compromised judgment. Alexander pours coffee with steady hands that she knows have killed men in the past 24 hours. The contrast between domestic gesture and brutal reality, making her head spin with the impossibility of reconciling the two versions of him that exist simultaneously in her awareness. He asks if she slept well, his tone suggesting he knows she did not, that he understands the turmoil keeping her awake in unfamiliar luxury. Eleanor tells him she spent the night thinking about how completely insane this situation is, how she should be demanding he honor his promise to let her leave safely, how every rational part of her brain is screaming that getting involved with a criminal who murders people is the worst decision she could possibly make. Alexander listens without defensiveness, his attention absolute in a way that makes her feel like the only person existing in his universe at this moment. And when she finishes, he asks what the irrational parts are saying, the parts that are not screaming warnings but whispering possibilities. Eleanor wants to deny those parts exist, but the lie dies before reaching her lips, because something about Alexander makes lying feel impossible, as though his ability to see through pretense is another weapon in his considerable arsenal. She admits quietly that the irrational parts keep remembering how his voice sounded in the darkness when he told her she was safe, how his hand felt when it closed around her wrist with strength tempered by gentleness. How alive she felt in those terrifying moments when her life was fracturing into something unrecognizable. Alexander reaches across the table and takes her hand, his thumb brushing across her knuckles, in a touch that sends electricity racing up her arm and settling somewhere in her chest where it glows like embers waiting for fuel. He tells her he has spent his entire adult life building walls between himself and vulnerability. That trust in his world gets people killed, so he stopped trusting anyone beyond the few who proved themselves through blood and years. That he has not let anyone close enough to matter because mattering creates weakness, and weakness is fatal. But then there was her voice in the darkness, singing to a man she thought could not hear, offering kindness without agenda or fear. And somewhere in those stolen moments of listening, he felt something shift in the carefully constructed armor he uses to survive his dangerous world. Eleanor asks what shifted, needing to understand what she represents to him beyond the obvious attraction and the novelty of someone untouched by his criminal reality. Alexander meets her eyes with an intensity that steals her breath and tells her he wants to be the man she was singing to, the one she felt safe beside, not just the monster his enemies fear. The confession tears something open in Eleanor's chest, exposing wants she has kept buried under practicality and caution her entire adult life, because men in her world did not talk about wanting to be better. They made excuses for being worse, and here is Alexander Ravenscroft, crime lord and killer, offering her a vulnerability that costs him more than she can fully comprehend. She asks what happens when he cannot be that man, when his world demands the monster and she is there to witness it, because she is not naive enough to believe love transforms darkness into light, no matter what fairy tales promised in childhood. Alexander does not flinch from the question, his thumb still tracing patterns on her knuckles that make rational thought increasingly difficult, and tells her he will not lie and claim his hands will ever be clean, that violence is woven into the fabric of everything he has built. But he can promise her honesty and choice, can promise that what he does to survive his world will never touch her, except in knowledge. Eleanor pulls her hand back, needing distance to think clearly, and stands to walk among the garden paths, where roses bloom in careful rows that remind her everything here is cultivated and controlled, even beauty. She asks if he understands how insane it is that she is even considering this, that 3 days ago her biggest problem was student loan payments and a persistent ex-boyfriend, and now she is contemplating what it means to be involved with someone who resolves problems with execution-style finality. Alexander rises and follows at a respectful distance, giving her space but remaining present, his patience another weapon in an arsenal she is defenseless against, because her whole life men have demanded and pressed and pushed. But this one waits. She tells him about Marcus, about the years she spent making herself smaller to avoid triggering his rage, about the relief when he finally left followed by the terror when he started calling again, about feeling helpless in the face of his determination to reassert control over her life. Alexander listens without interruption until she finishes, and when he speaks his voice carries a cold edge that should frighten her, but instead makes her feel safer than she has in years. He tells her Marcus will never touch her again, that the problem has been handled permanently, and Eleanor should ask what that means, should demand details. But she finds she does not want to know, because some part of her that she is not proud of feels savage satisfaction that someone finally made her tormentor face consequences. The realization that she can accept Alexander's violence when it serves her interests makes her question everything she thought she knew about her own morality, about the lines she believed were absolute, and she asks him if this is how it starts, if proximity to his world will erode her ethics, one compromise at a time, until she cannot recognize herself anymore. Alexander closes the distance between them, his hands coming to rest on her shoulders with careful gentleness, and tells her he will not let that happen, that her goodness is what drew him, and he has no interest in destroying it, but he also will